Go ahead and start the recording. We're recording now. Thank you very much. Again, welcome to the Beaches Watch Community Virtual Meeting for August. We're already August. We're glad you could join us, and we look forward to an informative session. We have Sean Lahav from he's a resiliency coordinator from the Northeast Florida Regional Council, and his presentation tonight will be Building Community Resilience in Northeast Florida. Following my announcements, we will have Sean's presentation, and as I had said earlier, the audience can leave any questions in the chat box, and after the presentation we will do a Q&A. So let me go ahead and make some brief announcements here. As you know, we are recording our meetings, and so they will be on our website tomorrow. So please stay tuned if you're not able to watch the entire presentation, or some people who missed it for whatever reason, they can always see it on our website. We're always looking to grow our membership, either by joining it for the first time or renewing your membership. As you can see, it's $15 for individual, $20 for family, and $5 for students. The membership runs from January through December, and you can go online at our website, which is beacheswatch.com. As you know, early voting has started this week. We held the Neptune Beach Candidate Forum, and that is also on our website, as well as the answers to the written questions that we sent the candidates who responded by the deadline. So they are on our website as well. We have 3 candidates running for seat 3. We have Esther Bird, John Cawley, and incumbent Carrie Chin. As I said, early voting started this week. It runs through August the 16th. You can vote at the Beaches Library, and then the primary election will be August 18th. It's that time of year for budget workshops for the beaches. So we have Atlantic Beach. They have their upcoming budget workshop coming up on Thursday, August the 6th at 6 p.m. Jack's Beach has 2 workshops coming up, August 10th and August 11th. And you can see that the subject matters that the workshops will cover on those 2 meetings. Our upcoming Beaches Watch meeting in September is obviously, we wanted to do something that was germane to our issues that we are seeing not only locally but nationwide and on an international basis, if you will. But our topic will be Beaches Black Youth panel discussion. This is going to be moderated by Mal Baker, and it's going to be a conversation about race, diversity, and experiences from the viewpoint of our Beaches Black youth. So we're really looking forward to this panel discussion. Put it on your calendar, September 2 at 7 p.m. Again, it'll be a virtual meeting, a Zoom meeting, but we know that this will really have a very lively conversation and hopefully very enlightening for us here at the beach. So please make sure you tune in for that. We're short tonight, so we will go ahead and start with our presentation. Again, we're having Sean Lahav, the Resiliency Coordinator from the Northeast Florida Regional Council. His topic is about building community resilience in Northeast Florida. And his presentation will focus on our coastal vulnerability, sea level rise of flooding, and he will also incorporate topics related to economic resilience with a special emphasis on the virus pandemic. It's my pleasure to introduce Sean Lahav. Sean, take it away and unmute.
All right, Marie, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sean Lahav, and I am the Resiliency Coordinator for the Northeast Florida Regional Council. So before we get started tonight, I would like to extend a very special thank you to Miss Maria Mark for inviting me to speak with all of you this evening. I worked with Maria back between 2015 and 2017 at the UNF Environmental Center. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to Mayor Ellen Glasser, who has also had a tremendous impact on my life. I worked with the City of Atlantic Beach when they navigated the Lead for Cities process back in 2018. So in addition to my professional role, I recently joined Florida State University in the PhD program in urban and regional planning, and I'm very engaged on a lot of different issues, so I'm very grateful to be here tonight. So the focus of this presentation is on this concept of community resilience, specifically what it means for Northeast Florida and here in Jacksonville and Duval County with the beach communities as well. So before we get to the content of this presentation, I'd like to take a few seconds to talk about the Northeast Florida Regional Council and the role that we hold in Northeast Florida. So the Northeast Florida Regional Council, also referred to as the NEFRC, was formed back in 1977 through Florida Statute. We are one of 10 regional planning councils in the state of Florida. And we work on a diverse spectrum of different program areas that include planning and policy, emergency preparedness, healthcare, economic development, and resiliency. In our scope across Northeast Florida, we serve 7 counties and 26 municipalities. So there's a very diverse geography here in Northeast Florida with a lot of unique challenges. And there's also a lot of unique communities, which makes this job very fun. So that's a little bit about the Regional Council. And the final note that I'll say about the NEFRC before moving forward is that we're uniquely positioned to tackle a lot of different issues because of our leadership structure. So the NEFRC Board of Directors is comprised of elected officials from all across the region, and we also have gubernatorial appointees selected in Tallahassee. We're directly linked with local governments across Northeast Florida, and we are here to serve the needs of local communities. So moving forward, the focus of my presentation this evening will be split up really into 2 sections. So the umbrella framework we're working with is community resilience, but underneath that framework, we really have to tackle coastal and environmental issues. And as we are all aware, because of the pandemic, we're also dealing with economic issues. So to start off the presentation, we're going to be talking about coastal hazards, vulnerabilities, and this issue of sea level rise that has gained a lot of traction recently in public policy circles. So in the state of Florida, local governments and communities on the ground really have been leading the way on these fronts when we're talking about adaptation planning and resilience planning. But at the state level in Tallahassee, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection has released guidance over the past that helps guide communities forward. So this framework issued by FDEP has been utilized by Atlantic Beach, for example, as they navigated their vulnerability assessment. And so I'm going to use this roadmap to really guide my presentation today to provide you all with some context about what is happening and then how to understand these issues from an all-encompassing perspective. So the first thing that we have to establish, what does resilience mean? And when we're looking at different communities, resilience means a lot of different things to different people. So set aside the pandemic for 1 second and imagine that we're functioning in a normal times right now, where we're all going to work, there's no problems. The community is at 100% functionality. And then a shock event, like a hurricane, in this instance, when we're talking about coastal resilience, comes and infiltrates the community. It causes the community to lose function. Resilience is what happens in that downtime. And it's really, how does the community absorb that loss of functionality and how can it recover quickly and effectively? But more importantly, beyond that real-time event, how can we learn from what took place during that event to improve our resilience moving into the future? So it's really an evolving process. It never stops. And we constantly need to reassess what hazards threaten our local communities. And in the state of Florida, as we're all aware, hurricanes are the biggest coastal hazard we experience and face. Irma back in 2017 was larger than practically the state, and it swept up across all of Florida, and it left behind devastating impacts. And so when we're looking at this issue in Florida, it really is an economic issue, especially when we're looking at the consequences that are left behind from these types of events. So I grew up in South Florida in Boynton Beach, and my parents have been in business in Big Pine Key, Monroe County, for over 30 years. And I firsthand have seen the direct economic impacts that a storm event can have on a small business and family with loss of inventory due to flooding and things like that. So a huge component of these conversations is the on-the-ground perspective of what people are dealing with. So this isn't only an environmental issue, this is in every sense an economic issue as well. So a useful framework that we can utilize to look at the challenges that face our communities is this idea of stresses versus shocks. So as I mentioned previously, hurricane events, they come in over a few days, over a period of a week, and they cause immediate impacts. So on the lower right here, we have an image taken in Flagler Beach in Flagler County, where A1A was completely destroyed because of storm surge. This happened immediately, and it was a quick shock event. But looking in the long term, 20, 30, even 100 years, there are other things that influence how our communities respond, and especially when we're looking at the issue of sea level rise. So there's a global phenomenon taking place at the international level in places like Greenland and the Arctic, and it's having local impacts that vary from region to region. And in places like Miami Beach, they're starting to see nuisance flooding when the sky is blue and king tides push water out of their storm systems onto the streets. So as I said, there's huge ramifications for these types of events, and local governments in the state of Florida are starting to proactively plan for the future. And so to visualize what we're talking about when we're looking at something like a stress, such as sea level rise, we're very fortunate here in Jacksonville and Duval County to have a federal tide gauge owned by NOAA right at Mayport at the mouth of the river. And what we know historically since around 1930 is that over the past 100 years, there's been about a 9 to 10 inch increase in sea level rise here at the local level. And the question really from here goes, how far into the future will this continue? At what exponential rate will occur? And so these are the discussions that local governments and communities are having. And in Northeast Florida, we're really anticipating a 2 to 3 foot increase in rise because of climate change over the next 60 years. But then in the more immediate sense, there's still the reality of flood events and storms and what that means for our communities. So this picture was taken after a storm passed through Northeast Florida, right in front of the Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce. And the downtown area was completely flooded. And this has huge consequences for our community. So this is really establishing some context of what we're dealing with and why there's a need for community resilience. So moving forward, the lessons that I want to share with you all today relate to better understanding our vulnerabilities in local communities. So when we're looking at the concept and framework of vulnerability, there's 3 components. There's this idea of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And combined, this really addresses our vulnerabilities. So I'm going to go through each of these. So these are all rhetorical questions. We obviously know the answer. And I took the image on the left off of Zillow in Neptune Beach, so I apologize if this is anyone's home. But basically, there's a home in Neptune Beach right on the ocean, and then you have a home in North Carolina, 5,000 feet above sea level. The home on the left is obviously more exposed to the issue of sea level rise than the home on the right. So when we're thinking about exposure, we're simply thinking about where is an asset, whether it be a residential home or a commercial facility, where is it located in relation to a hazard such as storm surge or sea level rise? And that can lead us into certain discussions. So back in 2019, we partnered with Taylor Engineering, a local coastal engineering firm here in Jacksonville, to develop an online mapping tool that helps educate local stakeholders about the exposures that are present here in Northeast Florida. And I'll share this link with Maria afterwards to make sure all of you receive it. So it takes you to this website where it specifically outlines all of the counties in Northeast Florida, and you have all of these different data layers to choose from. So I'm going to use this to look at different exposures across Northeast Florida. So one of the first questions, for instance, if you're purchasing a home or if you're trying to sell a home, are you in a flood zone? Do I need flood insurance? Well, if you're in the state of Florida, you will most likely want flood insurance no matter what. But one of the first questions you should be asking, you should look at the address of where you're trying to locate and where you're trying to purchase a property and determine if it's in a flood zone or not. But then beyond that kind of residential and individual perspective, there's also the critical facilities element that governments are starting to navigate when it comes to public works and emergency facilities. So back however many years ago in Satellite Beach, Florida, there was a fire station where a fire truck could not get out of the station during an emergency event because there was floodwaters that inundated the station. It created a public emergency. And so they combined that real-time event with the results of a vulnerability assessment they conducted, and they decided to move the fire station in their capital improvement plan. So here we have a fire station located near Palm Valley Landing. And so under a Category 2 hurricane, this fire station and surrounding area could potentially be inundated by stormwater. And then looking into the future with 3 feet of sea level rise potentially beyond the horizon, we can tell that this entire area can potentially be transformed moving into the next coming decades. So the question is this the most appropriate place for a fire station, or should this fire station in this area be on higher ground? And then moving forward beyond geographical kind of location of an asset, not all assets respond to the same to certain events, and not all assets are built the same. So here in this case, or this example, we have 2 homes, they're side by side, they're neighboring homes. One is on the ground and one is elevated on stilts, like you see in the Florida Keys down in Marathon and Key West. So obviously the home on the right will perform at a higher level of efficiency during storm surge than the home on the left. So this is part of the vulnerability question. How are we building? What are our building codes and things like that? But then we can also take this same concept and look at social populations as well and demographics. So when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans back in the 2003 timeframe, low-income communities in that area faced severe impacts from the storm, all the way to the extent of death. Where wealthier and higher income families had access to capital, they had access to resources they could leave on time. So there are different elements at stake when we're looking at community resilience, and it's important to recognize these differences among community groups. And so, for example, down in Flagler Beach, beyond the critical facilities that are exposed here, we have a densely populated area with individuals that are over the age of 64. So not even thinking about sea level rise while it's depicted in this image, simply during a storm event, elderly populations are more difficult to manage because of their physical capacities and other factors. And right now, Jacksonville, the city of Jacksonville, is navigating a lot of issues related to social equity. And this map really shows census blocks for minority populations. And as we can tell, because of the river and tributaries, many of our most vulnerable populations in Northeast Florida live within reach of a lot of different coastal hazards, including storm surge. So this is a very important question that we have to start navigating. And finally, Mayport Naval Air Station and Mayport Village is a very interesting case study to look at when we're talking about sea level rise. So with the military installation in itself, there's the question of how far into the future can it remain viable from the federal government's perspective. But then when we're looking at Mayport Village, which is a historically African-American community, and it's also low income, the only access point, or one of the only access points, is through A1A. And if we turn on 2 feet of sea level rise in that area leading into where the ferry is, that road might potentially be inundated in the next 20 to 30 years, where the access point to Mayport Village might be completely cut off. So obviously this is a very complex situation, and it's a very complex topic to discuss, but it's important to have these discussions. And then finally, the final question that relates to vulnerability is what is the adaptive capacity of a given community? So these 2 pictures were taken in Mexico Beach back in 2018 when Hurricane Michael, a Category 5 hurricane, completely devastated the panhandle of Florida. And so this individual homeowner, they built their house to a very high degree of resilience. They elevated the home, they invested in very sound building techniques, but all around the home, the entire community was devastated. And so if I were to return to this home after the storm had passed, I don't know if I would want to live here anymore. So the real big question is when we're talking about community resilience, individual investments and decisions related to resilience are vital and extremely important. But if we're not taking a whole of community approach to these issues, we're truly missing the larger picture of how this can affect our livelihoods. And so one of the complicated challenges in Duval County is simply the population density in certain areas like San Marco. So we turn on 3 feet of sea level rise in San Marco, and we can see that this entire urban core area would be completely transformed. And in addition to those commercial and residential densities, we also have hospitals and medical facilities here that many people from around the country even depend on, that are vulnerable to the effects of sea level rise and storm surge. The hospitals are taking proactive steps to address these things, but the question is, over time, will they be viable enough? So now that we have some context established about how to understand vulnerability, it's also important to talk about solutions that are available. And there's a wide spectrum of available adaptation strategies that communities across Florida and across the United States are choosing to adopt as they navigate these issues. And so one of the most popular frameworks out there, especially in federal circles and at the local level, is this concept of nature-based solutions. So we can build resilience by working with nature, mimicking nature. Living shorelines are a great example, using living shorelines rather than bulkheads. And then in Jacksonville, for example, the Public Works Department has recently started to implement tide flex valves depicted on the bottom picture that allow water to exit during a storm event, but it does not allow water to come back into clogged pipes or to push back. And then a great example of green infrastructure can be found in Tallahassee, Florida, so Cascades Park. They had an area of the community that flooded repetitively over the years and had so many issues when it came to precipitation events. And stakeholders came together and decided that we were going to completely transform this area into a park that uses a lot of green infrastructure techniques for storm mitigation and flood mitigation, but it also produces co-benefits that the community can recreate in. It's aesthetically pleasing. It shows a holistic approach to these issues. And then finally, with the mapping tool, we're very fortunate. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation back in 2018 selected the St. Johns River watershed as one of 6 watersheds that they would research across the entire United States. And part of this research identified resilience hubs, areas that have ecosystem services from a habitat perspective, but they also have flood mitigation and community benefits from that perspective, so dual benefits. And so areas in dark purple are identified as resilience hubs. When we go to the Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve north of the St. Johns River, an area that many of us love to recreate in and boat and fish, there's extreme benefits that are present here from a flood mitigation perspective because there are so many wetlands. So all of the Timucuan Preserve is identified as an important resilience hub for this region. And when we turn on a doomsday scenario of 6 feet of sea level rise, what we see is that this entire area absorbs the impact of sea level rise. And so the lesson that can be learned from looking at these pictures is that if you were to fill these wetlands, let's say with subdivisions and shopping plazas, you're not only losing that community benefit that wetlands produce and provide to Duval County and the surrounding area, but you're also putting human assets in harm's way. So there's a lot of development and land use challenges ahead that, again, we have to have serious discussions around. And so moving forward, I'd really just like to emphasize there is so much going on right now in 2020 when it comes to resilience, not only in Florida, but specifically here in Northeast Florida. So my primary objective at the Regional Council is to coordinate all of these efforts between local, state, and federal entities. And just to highlight some of the federal involvement and regional involvement that's taking place here, over the past several years, the U.S. Department of Commerce, Economic Development Administration has provided us with grant funding to navigate a lot of these issues. We recently received a grant to address the pandemic and economic resilience, which I'll talk about in a few seconds. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a few years ago, received millions of dollars from Congress to produce the South Atlantic Coastal Study that'll help local communities address these challenges. Northeast Florida was selected as a specific focus area for the study, and we provided a list of stakeholders from the beach communities to address challenges related to the sub-area of the intracoastal around Atlantic, Neptune, and Jacksonville Beach. And then we partnered with NOAA back in January to host a green infrastructure workshop. And most importantly, where you can see direct kind of lines drawn, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection has been providing resilience planning grants to local governments all across Northeast Florida. So to the best of my knowledge, Atlantic Beach utilized some of these funds to conduct their vulnerability assessment. Neptune Beach was selected in this fiscal year to receive funding from FDEP, and Jacksonville Beach over the past year has been navigating the vulnerability assessment as well. So there are so many efforts taking place, and we're really trying to position the regional council as a central clearinghouse to communicate all of this information. And beyond all of these partners, I would say that I'm most impressed by what's taking place at the local level here in Northeast Florida. So moving from the left to the right, we've been very focused on stakeholder engagement, on providing local government officials with training resources and discussions and avenues for talking about these things. So we had a green infrastructure workshop with NOAA, where we had a few staff members from beach communities join us as well. On the bottom left, Mayor Ellen Glasser joined me for a panel discussion at a conference that was facilitated in Jacksonville. There's a few other familiar faces on there as well to talk about how we're navigating these issues. And then most robustly, the Jacksonville beach communities have been doing an excellent job at leading the way on these issues. Atlantic Beach has been a shining example in the state of Florida. But then in Duval County, at the city level in Jacksonville, there's been a few processes underway over the past several years, including an adaptation action area working group that was focused on identifying long-range planning horizons. There was the Storm Resiliency and Infrastructure Review Committee focused on finding immediate short-term public works solutions. And then most recently, and probably most high profile, Councilman Scott Wilson and Councilman Matt Carlucci formed the Jacksonville Special Committee on Resiliency back in January of 2020. And we've been assisting with that effort ever since. Councilwoman Randy DeFore has recently been passed the torch on that front, and 3 different subcommittees aimed at engaging the public on these issues are currently underway in Duval County. So I can't say it enough, there is a lot happening, and it's often hard to keep apprised of, but one of our goals is to create an inventory of everything happening. And 2 examples just from the beach communities, really quick. The City of Atlantic Beach Vulnerability Assessment is on the bottom right, and then some results from the Jacksonville Beach process is also featured on the upper right as well. So if there's any lessons from this section of the presentation, it's that a lot of things tie into this issue of community resilience. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no quick and simple fix. These are difficult challenges to navigate, but when you build partnerships, when you educate the community, when we work together, you can really see a lot of results. And so moving forward, just on the closing component of my presentation, I really want to talk about the state of affairs of the world we're living in today, and how things have really been transformed since March. So we go back to March and February. You know, I think it's safe to say no one could have expected where we would be today all the way in August. It feels surreal in many ways. So what the pandemic has taught us from an economic perspective is that beyond coastal issues like sea level rise and hurricanes, we have to incorporate other dimensions or other hazards into this larger discussion if we really want to protect our local communities moving forward. So moving forward, we're really emphasizing this concept of economic resilience, and we're trying to separate it from the environmental issues so we can work in silos but under the same framework. And so when we're talking about economic resilience, it's the same concept, but it's really trying to protect local economies no matter what disaster or hazards we might face. And so during the pandemic, small businesses have been greatly impacted. You know, government fiscal funds have been impacted as well. So how can we look at this from an immediate sense and a long-range perspective to really protect our local economies? And so when the pandemic struck back in March, our focus shifted for a little bit, and we compiled all of these small business resources and distributed it across the region. Our guide was modeled across the entire state of Florida because it was such an evolving situation. And then my colleague Jack Shad and I produced an economic impact assessment to look at how specific industries and employment levels were being affected by the pandemic. And so when we're looking at this economic resilience framework, there's 2 things we have to look at: historical hazards, What lessons do we already have well established? You know, we're very used to hurricanes in Florida, so we have standards and procedures for dealing with those. And then, you know, looking back to 2008 and in other situations across American history, we've also dealt with economic recessions and the consequences of those types of events. But moving forward, there's things we're not certain about, and there's things that are very difficult to navigate, such as sea level rise. What planning horizons are we dealing with, and what assumptions are we talking about? And then, as we're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has completely transformed the world that we live in. And so the question is, how can we thrive in these evolving circumstances, no matter what situations might unfold in the future? And just to show you how kind of interconnected these things are, if sea level rise were to continue at an exponential rate, there is a question with the Mayport Naval Air Station, for instance. When does the federal government and the US Navy step in and say, we might retreat from this installation because of rising seas? That would have huge economic ramifications for Northeast Florida and for Duval County. And beyond the economic consequences, it would alter the character of local communities, especially for military families who live here. So this is an economic issue, an environmental issue, and an overall community character issue. And everything is interrelated when we're talking about these things. So just a few closing thoughts before we get to questions and answers. I think it's safe to say that beyond the horizon, there is a lot of uncertainty. Right now, you know, since March, we've been dealing with the pandemic. We were very fortunate to not get impacted by this recent storm event that passed along the East Coast. But there are things that are happening. We're in a very volatile situation as a country with social issues. We're dealing with an evolving climate. And so the question is, how do all of these things influence each other, and how do they exacerbate each other? And so this morning, we officially received funding from the U.S. Economic Development Administration to address the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic consequences of it over the next 2 years. In addition to that, we are going to establish a Northeast Florida Economic Resilience Task Force to create an action plan and long-term strategy that really looks at things from a holistic angle, both from the coastal environmental standpoint and from the economic standpoint. So one of the publications that you will be seeing from us very soon is this community resilience framework that will be established for Northeast Florida. And we will clearly outline how we are navigating different policy issues on the environmental front and then on the economic front. And we're going to show how all of these things tie together. So this will be a comprehensive inventory of local efforts, state efforts, and federal efforts. And we think this is going to be a very valuable resource for guiding us forward. So again, my name is Sean Lahav. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to interact with the beach communities today. Beyond my professional role, I love the community here in Duval County, and this is a special part of my life. So I'm very grateful to interact with people on the ground, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. So thank you, Maria, and thank you to everyone else for having me this evening. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Sean. That was a great presentation, a lot of information. And we really appreciate you coming and sharing everything that you and the Northeast Florida Regional Council have been doing, working with our local communities, particularly with our beaches communities. I was very happy to hear that both Neptune Beach and Jack's Beach will be receiving funds to conduct their vulnerability assessment, which is obviously the first phase that Atlantic Beach has completed. Do you know what the time frame is as far as Atlantic Beach moving to that next adaptation planning stage at this point?
Yeah, so with Atlantic Beach, so they conducted their coastal vulnerability assessment last year, which is really part of that, you know, establishing context and establishing a baseline to assess these issues from. And so more recently, you know, as of last summer, we've been working with the city just to provide, you know, outside speakers that can talk about specific adaptation strategies. And so with Atlantic Beach, through their environmental stewardship committee and through the administration, they've been tackling a lot of different environmental issues. So I think they're finally getting to that point where they have enough data to make decisions. And, you know, with individuals like Shane Corbin and Steve Swan, they're starting to have discussions about implementation, what facilities need to be adapted. So I think you're going to see a lot from Atlantic Beach moving into the future, and I think Mayor Ellen Glasser could confirm that.
Okay, great, great. We have a question from one of our participants. Are you looking for us to maybe move toward less fossil fuels and more solar at the beaches here in Northeast Florida? And what kind of monies are you speaking about from this morning? Economic recovery. And what can we as residents do? And thank you for your presentation. I can repeat this questions, compounded kind of questions.
So it looks like there's really two questions being asked. One really relates to essentially sustainability efforts and essentially climate change mitigation. And then the other question relates to the grant opportunity that I mentioned. So in addressing the first question, my area of focus at the Regional Council is really focused on adaptation and looking at how to deal with impacts. And when we're looking at the concept of sustainability, it is essentially a separate framework that I am not directly addressing in my efforts, but there's organizations like the North Florida Green Chamber of Commerce and other entities that are pushing forward those discussions that are equally as important. And I think right now in the public subcommittees that the city of Jacksonville is facilitating, there are expert speakers in those subcommittees who are advocating for less fossil fuel use, reducing emissions, and transferring to solar. Now, on the question of the grant opportunity, so the Regional Council is the designated economic development district for Northeast Florida. This is the way that the feds, funnel money in certain directions for projects. And so the money that we receive is dual focused. It's going to help us assess the situation that is currently unfolding and evolving because of the pandemic and what has been incurred from an economic perspective. So we'll work with stakeholders to develop strategies that can assist governments. But then as I mentioned, long range, we really want to create a regional plan that will identify all of these different threats that we're facing and identify strategies, from a regional perspective, diversifying our economy, so that if there is an event, one sector doesn't carry the whole region down. So those are the things we're looking at. And finally, on that last question, what can residents do? I think it's really important to just continue having discussions like this, what we're having tonight. It's really important to, voice your perspectives on issues you're dealing with. And when you have opportunities, let's say when your government's updating its comprehensive plan or you're doing a visioning session, to voice your concerns and really think about the long-term implications of what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I was just informed that Jack's Beach has already completed their vulnerability assessment. They completed that a few months ago. And Mayor Glasser said that they learned last week that their adaptation grant was awarded. So it looks like that's going to move forward. If there are any more questions from the audience, let me scroll down here real quick just to see. Okay, so can you just talk about in general, the nature-based solutions, living shorelines as opposed to bulkheads and hardscape. As you know, our neighbors to the south, Ponte Vedra, they're an extremely vulnerable community, particularly those that built right on the beach. And we saw that in some of our last weather problems. And so, and a lot of the neighbors there, they're thinking, oh, I need to do, a bulkhead. I need to do this hardscape. Are you guys doing any kind of, what kind of citizen education are you doing or have you done, as well as working with these engineering companies that may be the first thing that they jump to as far as, quick solution. Let's put in a bulkhead. Let's put in a hard, seascape kind of thing for protection, which, as we know, doesn't really, it might protect that one property, but then the other properties adjacent and so forth, they become victims of that, the erosion problem. So are you guys doing any kind of education as far as like with citizens and the engineering groups, engineering companies.
Yeah, so when we're looking at this kind of concept of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, what you'll repetitively hear at the local level right now in Jacksonville, and this is what I completely agree with, it's not it's a solution that works in a lot of specific situations, but it doesn't work everywhere. For instance, you're not going to protect Jacksport with living shorelines, but you can protect other areas, and it can be a substitute for seawalls and bulkheads, especially for residential property owners. So it's something that we are very engaged on and we're trying to promote further. And so one example of that, back in January, I reached out to NOAA in Charleston, South Carolina at the federal level and partnered with them to bring experts at the national level down to Jacksonville to host a full-day workshop where we brought local community groups, nonprofits, government officials, and engineers to actually do full-scale exercises to kind of look at implementation options and things like that. So that's one example. And then with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers study that is currently being conducted for the entire Southeast, one of the outcomes of that study will be adaptation strategies that communities can implement. And I have the book right here, actually. Engineering with Nature is a publication that the Army Corps released, and it goes over so many different examples. And you can check this out online, I believe. And so when we get to the final outcomes of that study, that will be one of the options that local governments can explore, have discussions about, and see where it works best. And the final note, I'll stay on the green infrastructure side of things. Last summer, the New York Times published an article that stated out of all of the cities in the United States, in all 50 states, they listed Jacksonville as the most expensive city to protect with seawalls if we were to proceed with that route. And it would cost somewhere around $3.5 billion to protect Duval County's extensive coastlines and tributaries if we chose to install, elaborate seawalls. So obviously, from a cost savings and financial standpoint, that's not going to be our strategy because we won't be able to afford it. So it's very important right now that we look at these alternative solutions, and really in the long term, in looking at the work of the North Florida Land Trust and some of the principles that the Timucuan Parks Foundation that used to direct promotes. I really do think that this nature-based concept will be the future in resilience planning.
Excellent. We have a question about COVID. So what businesses have Northeast Florida, the Northeast Regional Council helped with the COVID hardships? And how does a business get assistance?
That's a good question. So when the pandemic first hit, there was a lot of confusion, especially with chambers of commerce all across the state, as far as what resources were available. This was kind of a first of its kind event for a lot of us. Haven't experienced anything of this magnitude. So the first thing we did right away was do extensive research for a few days on every single small business, funding opportunity that was available with grants and loans. We made an inventory of that, and then we distributed it to every single chamber of commerce, which shared it with their small businesses. Now, we included our professional contact information on there, and throughout the process, mainly my colleague Jack Shad, he actually worked with business owners on the ground to help them navigate the bureaucracy of some of these grant applications. So we are not a chamber of commerce, and we're not necessarily a business representative entity, but in this situation, we did, to the best of our ability, to compile all of this to help individuals out. And I know that Jacksonville Beach shared the resource online, and I saw it shared especially in the beach communities across social media networks. So we do hope that assisted business owners in navigating these difficult times.
Great, thank you. Is the Regional Council working with the American Flood Coalition regarding sea level rise here in Northeast Florida? That's
a good question as well. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the American Flood Coalition, they are a policy group and sort of advocacy arm that was formed over a year ago. They're based in Washington, D.C., and a lot of their staff are actually based or, from Florida. They have a liaison directly for Florida governments. And they're really trying to build support at the national level through Congress of building a coalition of elected officials to have these discussions. They hosted a mayor summit in DC last year. I'm not sure who from the local community attended. We are in discussion with them. I speak with them, every so often about what they are working on in their updates. But the only thing that I have to be careful with and the regional council has to be careful with is that they do have an advocacy component, and because we work directly for local governments through county dues, and we have a board of directors with elected officials, we do have to be careful in navigating those types of discussions. And Mayor Glasser mentioned that Mayor Brown from Neptune Beach did attend that summit. So I do think a lot of interesting things are taking place with that group, and we are kind of in touch with them.
Okay, great. So as far as the deepening of the river, I mean, that's been a long time conversation. Funding is apparently moving forward for that. What's the regional council's, I wouldn't say position, because you can't obviously take the position, but what are you guys doing to help mitigate those potential environmental impacts that the deepening, we feel like will happen? So
obviously, as you mentioned, the dredging of the St. Johns River is a very, controversial issue in many ways. And to some extent, it's really the nexus of what we're talking about this evening, between the economic side and the coastal environmental side. So when we're looking at both of these frameworks, there's this concept, or this notion that we have to protect jobs and we have to continue creating jobs. And part of that is deepening the port in some people's perspective. But then there's the perspective of those entities like the St. Johns Riverkeeper and some environmental advocacy groups about the environmental impacts that will take place. We do not have a position on this issue, given the political nature and local nature of these discussions. But obviously, it's a very convoluted discussion with a lot of different things that need to be accounted for. And I would say from a resilience standpoint, if the river is to be dredged, it's important to have discussions about mitigation and kind of offsetting some of those impacts elsewhere. So there's a lot of different perspectives on this, and I'll leave that to entities like the Army Corps and local government officials to have those kind of more detailed discussions.
Okay. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it's not a new group, but it's kind of a coalition of like Scenic Jacksonville.
Yes, I am.
I think the Riverkeeper, they're working on kind of a master plan of river parks, making Jacksonville known as a river park. And I'm just wondering if you've had any contact with them. And obviously the subject matter we're talking about tonight has a major impact, especially when we're talking about potential development along the river, particularly around the sports complex and those areas. Are you guys going to work with those groups in any way, or have you been approached by them for assistance in any way?
So for clarification, are you specifically asking about Scenic Jacksonville or the Resiliency Coalition, or both?
Well, this is Scenic Jacksonville, I think, and I think they have a few other groups. I don't think it's part of the Resiliency Coalition.
So I am not fully up to speed on this specific topic that you mentioned, but I am interested in it, so I will follow up and look into it. But we are not directly engaged with Scenic Jacksonville, but through the City of Jacksonville Resiliency subcommittees that are underway. I'm fairly certain that there's representation from those groups who are voicing their opinions to city officials in Duval County. So I have seen action on a lot of different fronts from those specific groups in advocating for specific policies in Jacksonville.
And you have mentioned some of the committees that Councilman Carlucci is heading up, and DeFore. And do you know kind of what, not really what their charge is, but sort of what their timeline is as far as their recommendations, or maybe what their charge is as a committee for this?
Okay, and does that relate to the question that just popped, or I can address both. There was a question about so basically from a high level standpoint, the COJ Resiliency Committee was established back in January, and it was provided a charge of the issues that it would look at. And so originally before the pandemic, what was scheduled, and my CEO and I, Beth Payne, have been supporting the city in kind of a back capacity in supporting their role. And so there were 6 meetings scheduled between January and June that, you know, you would have all of the committee members, and we would bring in guest speakers to talk about specific issues. But the pandemic kind of halted that for a little bit. And then over time, the new realm with Zoom technology, it switched to these subcommittees that are going to be working all the way until April. So between January and March, we brought in state perspectives to talk with the committee. The Army Corps made a presentation as well to talk about sea level rise and the challenges facing Duval County moving into the future. We've also been in discussion, you know, with the Chief Resilience Officer in Miami-Dade County to share his experiences. But the focus now, there's 3 subcommittees. There's an infrastructure subcommittee, an environmental planning subcommittee, and then a community engagement and neighborhood subcommittee. And so each of these subcommittees that operate under the Resiliency Special Committee, they each have a different focus, and they're comprised of subject matter experts from the community. So like Steve Swan, for instance, from Atlantic Beach, an engineer, he is serving on the environmental planning subcommittee, just to give an example. And they've been tasked really to look at those specific issues, have routine discussions once every 2 weeks. And over time, by, through October all the way until April, their task is to form white papers that will inform the city about how to move forward. And in conjunction with those efforts, you have very active kind of things happening with the Public Works Department, and the city spent over $600,000 on a vulnerability assessment that is getting underway with a private consultant. So those results will be made available by April. So moving forward, there will be all of this subcommittee engagement. The special committee will soon meet again as a whole committee. And you're going to see a lot more kind of outcome-driven results moving into December and into 2021. And I know that was a lot to go over, but I just wanted to kind of touch on all of that.
And the COJ Resiliency Committee, is their focus primarily Jacksonville and not the beaches, or is it countywide? I'm just not sure.
Yes, so from the committee's perspective and from the city's perspective, to the best of my understanding, the focus is on what the city of Jacksonville is financially responsible for. That's just the reality of when we're dealing with government, even in a consolidated county. And I think what supports that also is the fact that each of the individual beach communities have been navigating these issues independently in a robust manner. So there is incorporation based on the fact that you have representation with individuals like Steve Swan serving on the committee. But as far as the final outcomes, they're really going to be focused on the COJ related boundaries.
Okay. Will COJ be incorporating business resiliency as well?
That's a great question. And so before I get to that answer, the regional council has been leading this kind of these resiliency discussions since 2013 with a business sector kind of perspective in mind. It's very different from what you see across the rest of the state. South Florida is very government centric with their compacts between different counties. And so, since 2013 with the P2R2 committee, we've been focused on this business private sector approach. And we hope that the city will incorporate that into their overall strategies. It is being discussed, and you know, what can businesses do, what can the private sector do to address these issues. But I can't speak for the city, but I can speak for the regional council. Moving forward, again, with economic resilience, we are very concerned about the private sector, and we really think that if things are going to happen in Northeast Florida, the private sector, CEOs and businesses are going to play a huge role in moving those discussions forward with entities like Baptist. So you will see a lot from us and potentially from the city as well.
Okay. We're right at 7:55. It doesn't look like we have any more questions from the audience. But I just have one quick question. I say quick. You brought up development and land use. I mean, obviously, the pressures of developing and our development. What can the regional council or us generally, I guess, as a community do to work within those frameworks? Because obviously we're talking about the economic impacts, and that's part of the development process, but then it's also responsible development, responsible land use regulations and things like that. Is that something you can give some insight to, or is that just something we as citizens need to just stay involved with?
No, absolutely. And so this is an interesting question in that the answer really varies between communities. So as many of you are familiar with, a place like Jacksonville Beach, to the best of my understanding, is really built out. So the question is, what are you doing with kind of existing structures? And it's not really about future, empty land. But I know we have some former commissioners in here and planning commission members for Jacks Beach and neighborhood cities. The first component of this from a planning standpoint is the comprehensive plan for local government. That's really a good opportunity to address long-range challenges. In the state of Florida, local governments like Jacks Beach, Neptune Beach, and Atlantic Beach, with a coastal management element in their comprehensive plans, are required to address the issues of flooding and sea level rise after state law was passed in 2015, parallel flood. So that's really the starting point. But then the next question comes down to what decisions are going to be made, and beyond infrastructure decisions within the purview of local government administrators, it's going to come down to planning commissions and how those decisions unfold. So the only thing I'll share with you from that perspective is a lesson from elsewhere. In 2019, a judge in Virginia ruled that I believe the Virginia Beach, or a local city in Virginia, ruled that the Planning Commission could actually factor sea level rise into land use decisions, and that's a huge decision from a legal perspective, because it has very big ramifications for developers and for local communities. So I can't give a certain answer, but I can say that there are things happening elsewhere around the country that we can learn from, and maybe we can apply those lessons to the decisions we're making at the local level here in Northeast Florida.
Well, Sean, our time is just about up. I just want to thank you so much for your informative and comprehensive presentation. I think we can find these resources on the Regional Council's website. Is that right?
Yes, sorry about that. Yep. So if you go to NEFRC.org, you can learn more about the Northeast Florida Regional Council, and under programs, there will be a specific page for resiliency. We will be updating this moving into the future, and I will be sure to share with Beaches Watch PDFs and documents as they become available with our future efforts.
Excellent. Well, Sean, thank you again. As one of my former environmental leadership graduates, you've done me proud, and continue doing the great work, you and your team at the Regional Council. You guys have a lot on your plate, and you're just doing an amazing job. So thank you so much for taking your time, presenting this information to us here at the Beaches. So I want to thank you all for participating. Again, please, if you can, just take our short survey at the end. This just makes sure that, like I said, our meetings are relevant. We're bringing you the information that you think is important, and we like to get your feedback. So until next month, make sure you tune in. Again, it's going to be discussing racial diversity and the challenges that our Black youth have had here in our own communities. So be sure to join us then. All right, Sean, see you in the trenches. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.